Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to present to you this package called Hex-Utils, a set of tools supporting hexagonal rasters. This is the outline of this address. I will briefly talk about hexagons, and then I will try to justify why they should be used in GIS. I will then follow on by presenting briefly the HexASCII file format, and then the Hex-Utils API that allows us to work with this file format. I will then present some command line tools that were built on this API, and finally I will refer to the future work in the pipeline. So hexagons are everywhere. This is more of a declaration. Before I follow on, I would like to ask you if you can remember the last time you saw an hexagonal pattern. Keep that question in mind as I go along. There are many examples of hexagonal patterns in nature. This is one of the best known. Insect eyes. They don't have just two eyes like us, they have thousands. And if we zoom in, we can see that these eyes are actually these small hexagonal elements that are cast on the forehead of the insect. But we find hexagons in many other forms in nature, like this example with corals. If you look closely to one of each of these coral elements, you will see that it will have exactly 6 neighbors. Plants themselves are very fond of hexagons, and you can find hexagonal patterns in many aspects of plants, like in this case with petals. Also in branches. This is especially visible in young bushes and young trees that they grow in this fashion. But also at a macroscopic scale. These are images of a phenomenon called the fairy circles. These are openings in the vegetation that exist in arid regions such as Australia and sub-Saharan Africa. And about 20 years ago, someone found out that when viewed from space or from the sky, the circles are cast in an almost perfect hexagonal pattern. To this day, no one really knows why, but it's a clear hexagonal pattern. If we zoom in further to the microscopic level, we see that plant cells themselves are hexagons, with the 6 sides on a somewhat irregular fashion, but clear an hexagonal pattern. Another interesting example with snow crystals. There is no snow crystal alike, but all of them follow this pattern with 6 angles of 60 degrees. Another example with graphene. This is the hardest material known to us, and it's actually a mesh, and where the carbon atoms are the vertices of the hexagons. The North Pole of Saturn, this was found out by the Cassini probe some years ago. This very, very large hexagonal shape in the north of the planet. There's a number of people trying to understand why this is so. Still pretty much of a mystery, but one of the most visible features in the solar system, like the red spot in Jupiter. So actually my thesis on this is that many times we believe we are looking at random patterns, but they are actually hexagonal. Why is this happening exactly? I will go through here a small exercise that exemplifies this. This is a Voronoi-Poisson distribution, just a number of points that are cast randomly in a consigned space. Now I take the Voronoi polygons to each of this point, and this is the end result. Pretty random apparently, but if I count the number of sides in each of these Voronoi polygons, we can see that on average they have 6 sides. Now I repeat this exercise with a constraint. So around each point there is a zone of influence that prevents another point from being there. So there is kind of a minimum distance between of each these random points. I take again the Voronoi polygons, count again the number of sides, and the average is again very, very close to 6, but actually the distribution has become much narrower, so the standard deviation is now smaller. If I continue increasing this minimum distance between the points, the distribution gets narrower and narrower, and now almost half the points have almost half the polygons have 6 sides, and if I keep increasing this distance, this will trend eventually to a perfect hexagonal pattern. So this is all very interesting about hexagonal patterns. So why should we use them in GIS? Well, if we go back to the 1940s, 1950s, when computers were being developed, in the early days, it was very common to use matrices to store data and to play around with data, because matrices are very, very useful. They are easy to use. We access data points with number of row, number of columns, so pretty pragmatic, pretty easy stuff. However, as computer science evolved and more complex algorithms and more complex tasks were being performed with computers, at a certain point, these early computer scientists started hitting very important problems with squares. One of them is here represented, which is called the border paradox. If you consider here this border created by these green cells and with the von Neumann neighborhood, we can see that this border is actually open because these two cells here are not neighbors of each other. However, the center cell here is actually isolated because it's not a neighbor of this cell here outside the border. Now, if we use a Moore neighborhood, the extended neighborhood, now the border is closed because these two cells are neighbors. But the center cell is actually now in contact with the exterior because it is a neighbor of this cell here. So this was the kind of problems that in the 1960s the first computer scientists were dealing with, and obviously they understood that with hexagons none of this happens. So with hexagons, each cell has exactly 6 neighbors. Each of these neighbors stands at exact the same distance and shares exactly one side. This led to the first proposals for hexagonal computations and hexagonal digital systems. A bit later on in the 1970s, there was this finding by Mr. Messerot that is very, very important here for our domain of GIS. If we want to sample a signal in space, it is far more efficient to do it with hexagons than in squares. This is basically a result of the compactness of the hexagonal pattern. And to sum it up, to capture the same signal with the same precision, so to say, so capturing the same frequencies in the Fourier spectrum, we need less 13.4% samples with hexagons vis-a-vis squares. There is a corollary to this that is even more interesting, that to perform the fast Fourier transform, the hexagonal pattern requires less 25% memory and computational cycles. Now, just a few years later, there was this finding that kind of vindicated this. So people studying the physiognomy of primates, I believe, they understood that in mammals, in all mammals, the cells that capture light inside the eye bulb are actually distributed in an hexagonal pattern. What this means is that nature, when it needs to sample signals, it uses hexagonal patterns. It doesn't use square patterns like we do. 1980s, another important result was this related with the Navier-Stokes equation. So for over a decade at this time, scientists were trying to reproduce this equation with cellular automata on a square grid, invariably failing, until this point where this gentleman, they tried it on an hexagonal mesh, and actually they observed that with this mesh the automata will trend towards the Navier-Stokes equilibrium in the continuum. I myself have been working with hexagons now for over a decade. This is one of my first earlier results. It was a study on the directions of water flow, so related to hydrography, and it is clear that there is a certain advantage with hexagonal meshes in representing and preserving flow direction. So there is a higher degree of accuracy in this regard using hexagons. And this is the most recent work I've been doing with hexagons. This is the two maps produced by the same flood model, a rapid flood model. On top, the result with a square grid, and on the bottom with an hexagonal mesh. This is exactly the same model, and even though it produces at the end of the simulation more or less the same flooded areas, the flow velocity during simulation is much higher with hexagons. And a posteriori we verify that actually the hexagons are much more accurate. So what we can understand from this work is that the hexagons provide a much more precise picture of the hazards created by a flooding than with the squares. Okay, so knowing these advantages, we come now to the HexASCII file format. The fact that hexagons are known to be advantageous in various domains, in various aspects relative to squares, has not yet produced a software that would ease their use. So developers in general are not really sensible to these matters, apparently. So if we want to work with hexagonal rasters, you do not have the tools available for that. What you have to do is rely on vector tessellation, so you create your own tessellation with a vector and then try to work from there. This has a very obvious disadvantage vis-a-vis a traditional raster, because you have to store beyond the value of the cell itself. You have to store the values of each vertex of the cell. So with 6 vertices and 1 value, we need 7 values per cell. There is an obvious need for a raster format in GIS because of this. So what would be the advantages of such an hexagonal raster file format? First of all, implicit geometry. So as in a traditional raster, you don't need to specify the vertices of every single cell. You just define the geometry of the mesh and that's it. By doing so, you increase accuracy, because you do not need to calculate and encode the coordinates of these vertices, which are of course bound to errors and lack of accuracy in the computation itself. Naturally, there's also a reduction in storage space from 7 numbers in minimum to just 1. And this format could start to be the basis for an interoperability standard, so that different GIS tools can communicate and can use the same kind of hexagonal rasters. And this standard also fosters software development. Now, if I know that other software uses this kind of grids, then I know it's safe for me to develop on this file format. Oh, this led me to specify the HexASCII file format that has been the basis of my most recent work with hexagons, which is basically a text file that includes a number of metadata fields that describe the geometry of the hexagonal mesh, its location, and then a string of values. So this is highly inspired on the ASCII raster format that was specified by Esri a number of years ago for square rasters. And now we come to the Hex-Utils API, the software that allows us to work with this kind of grids, meshes. Excuse me. So there is a domain model. The main model has the base concept of a raster, including the metadata that defines the raster, defines the geometry, positions the mesh in space, and then it has some methods to read and write the raster from this. And then there are 2 physical classes, one for the Esri ASCII file format and another to the HexASCII hexagonal raster format. So with each one with their specific methods and specific properties. Now this is a brief example of how to use this API. So it's written in Python, a language that is becoming more and more popular with researchers. And fairly straightforward to use. Import the class definition, creating a new HexASCII object, initializing with an extent, with a position in space and cell side, and then here an example where very simple example where just a number of where random numbers are inserted in each of the cells, and then methods to save this raster as an HexASCII file. So pretty straightforward stuff. And with this API, then I developed a number of command line tools that have eased this work, in flood modeling, etc., with hexagonal rasters. The first tool is this one called ask to HexASCII, which transforms an existing squared raster into an hexagonal raster. It takes as inputs some flags here deciding if the transformation should maintain spatial resolution or maintain cell area, selection of an interpolation method, and then an input and then an output file. To perform this, there is here a bit of a complicated computation to position the resulting hexagonal grid. This is because the hexagonal grid does not equate to an exact rectangle as a square grid does in the Euclidean space. So there are a number of small computations that are made in order for the hexagonal raster to cover as much as possible of the square raster, but without using an excessive number of cells. The CSV to HexASCII tool, as the name implies, transforms a CSV file including this triplet of x, y value into an hexagonal raster. It takes as input an extent on which the interpolation is to take place, then a cell site for the resulting raster, and then input and output files. And here is a simple example of how to call this from the command line. Another input tool is this one called surface to HexASCII that transforms an analytical or mathematical function into an hexagonal raster. Again, takes an extent as input, the extent where the new hexagonal raster will be created, the desired cell site, and then the coordinates to a Python module and a Python function where this function is defined. And finally, an output file. And the last set of tools are these two called HexASCII to GML and HexASCII to GeoJSON. And what they do is transforming an hexagonal raster into a vector. Why is this useful? It's useful because then the vector can be opened in a traditional GIS software and used to create maps. Basically, this is how these maps you can see here were created. And just here an example with QGIS, and here a nice hexagonal raster portrait in the program. Okay, so future work, where will this lead eventually? This little package Hex-Utils is just the beginning of what I hope to be a longer and larger project. I would like to address other input sources, such as LiDAR, such as vectors, and then come to some sort of hexagonal map algebra with many of the usual raster operations that GIS users are expecting in a GIS. There is already a prototype that was coded in the C# language many years ago, when this language appeared to be a bit more useful than it appears to be now. And this is a good candidate to be translated into Python and to be coupled with the Hex-Utils. And of course, I have to think on user interaction, on user interfaces, and to that end there is now a QGIS plugin under development that I hope to be usable, I wouldn't say ready, but usable somewhere this summer. And that's all. Thank you.